The Rocky Mountains stood like frozen sentinels against the pale winter sky of 1875, their peaks crowned with snow that never melted, even in the harshest summer heat. Clara, the heavy Vance, had heard stories about these mountains, how they swallowed men whole, how the winters could freeze a person solid in minutes, how only the strongest survived. As she stood on the wooden platform of the railway station in Pine Ridge, Colorado Territory, she wondered if perhaps the mountains might be kinder to her than people had been. The train whistle echoed one final time before the locomotive pulled away, leaving Clara alone with her single worn trunk and a heart that had been shattered into so many pieces she'd stopped counting. Around her, the other passengers dispersed quickly, eager mail-order brides rushing into the arms of waiting husbands, merchants heading to the general store, prospectors with dreams of gold glittering in their eyes. But Clara remained rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to breathe, because Thomas Whitmore, the man who had promised, through carefully penned letters to cherish her, to give her a home, to love her regardless of worldly appearances, had taken one look at her substantial form and spat, actually spat. The glob of tobacco-stained saliva had landed just inches from her worn boots. "That's what you sent me?" Thomas had snarled at the station master as if Clara were a piece of damaged freight. "That mountain of flesh. I asked for a wife, not a carnival attraction." The laughter from the crowd of onlookers had cut deeper than any knife. Men had slapped their knees, women had hidden their smiles behind gloved hands, and children had pointed with the cruel honesty only children possessed. Clara had stood there in her best dress, the gray wool one she'd sewn herself with extra fabric carefully let into the seams, and felt her soul crumble. Thomas had thrust an envelope at the station master. "Consider our arrangement terminated. I'll not be legally bound to that. He'd struggled for a word cruel enough, finally settling on burden. Then he'd mounted his horse and ridden away, leaving Clara with no money for a return ticket, no prospects, and nowhere to go. Her father had made it abundantly clear when he'd arranged this marriage that she was not welcome back home. "You're 28 years old, Clara," he'd said, unable to meet her eyes. "We've 6 other mouths to feed. This is your chance. Don't waste it." She hadn't wasted it. It had been stolen from her the moment she'd stepped off that train. Now, as the sun began to set behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood red, Clara sank onto her trunk and tried to decide what came next. The station master had already disappeared into his office. Unwilling to deal with the embarrassing situation, the platform had emptied. The temperature was dropping rapidly, as it did in the mountains, and Clara had nowhere to sleep, nothing to eat, and no one who cared whether she lived or died. "Maybe that's for the best," she whispered to herself, watching her breath form clouds in the frigid air. "Maybe it would be easier if I just didn't." "Don't!" The voice came from behind her, deep and rough as gravel. Clara spun around, her heart hammering to find a man standing in the shadows cast by the station building. No, not a man, a mountain. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to span the width of a doorway. A thick beard covered most of his face, dark brown shot through with threads of silver. But it was his eyes that held her, pale gray like winter frost, and fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Don't what?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible. The man stepped into the dying light, and Clara saw the scar a vicious line that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, puckering the skin and pulling at the corner of his eye. He looked like something out of a nightmare, a creature of the wilderness dressed in buckskin and fur. "Don't give up," he said simply. "World's got enough ghosts already." Clara laughed, a bitter sound that surprised her. "And what would you know about it?" "More than you'd think." He studied her for a long moment, then jerked his chin toward the mountains. "I live up there. Cabin's about 12 miles from here. I need someone to keep the place when I'm out running my trap lines. Someone who can cook, mend, keep a fire going. You interested?" Clara stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "You're offering me work?" "Offering you a roof, food. Work comes with it, but that's fair trade." He paused, and something flickered across his weathered face, something that might have been sympathy or might have been pain. "You can stay as long as you need to. No obligations beyond pulling your weight. And up there," he gestured to the darkening peaks, "nobody cares what you look like. Cold doesn't discriminate, and neither do I." It was the strangest job offer Clara had ever received. It was also the only one. "I don't even know your name," she said. "Silas Kincaid. Most folks call me Bear." He picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing at all. "You comin' or not? Gets dark fast up here, and I don't fancy traveling these roads blind." Clara rose from her makeshift seat, her legs trembling beneath her skirts. She had no reason to trust this scarred stranger, this mountain man who'd appeared like some rough-edged angel in her darkest moment. But she also had no reason not to. The worst had already happened. What more did she have to lose? "Clara Vance," she said quietly. "And yes, I'm coming." The journey to Silas's cabin was unlike anything Clara had experienced. They traveled not by road, but by narrow game trails that wound through pine forests so thick the fading light barely penetrated. Silas moved with surprising grace for such a large man, his steps sure and silent, while Clara struggled behind him, her breath coming in gasps as the altitude and exertion took their toll. He never once told her to hurry, never showed impatience. When she stumbled on a root hidden beneath the snow, his hand shot out to steady her, gentle despite his obvious strength. When they stopped to rest, he offered her water from a canteen and strips of dried venison that were surprisingly good. "How long have you lived up here?" Clara asked during one such rest, her curiosity overcoming her exhaustion. 7 years, Silas replied, his eyes scanning the darkening forest with the wariness of someone who knew its dangers intimately. "Used to have a farm down in the valley. Wife, 2 children. Clara heard the past tense and understood. "I'm sorry. Fever took them while I was away selling cattle." His voice was flat, emotionless, but his hands clenched into fists. "Came home to 3 fresh graves. Neighbors said they'd called for me. Sarah, my wife, she kept asking where I was." He was quiet for a moment. "Been up here ever since? Easier that way? Easier to be alone? Easier not to fail anyone else?" The words hung between them, heavy with shared pain. Clara recognized a kindred spirit, someone who'd also learned that hope was just another word for disappointment. They reached the cabin as the last light faded from the sky. It was larger than Clara had expected, built from thick logs that had been carefully chinked against the mountain cold. Smoke curled from a stone chimney. The roof was steep to shed snow. A covered porch ran along the front, stacked with split firewood. "It's wonderful," Clara said, meaning it. Silas grunted, pushing open the heavy door. "It's warm and dry. That's all that matters." Inside, the cabin was a single large room divided into functional spaces. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall with a cooking crane and Dutch oven. Rough shelves held supplies: flour, salt, coffee, dried beans. A table with 2 chairs sat near the fire. In the corner, Clara saw a bed covered with fur pelts. In the opposite corner stood a smaller cot. "That's yours," Silas said, nodding toward the cot. "I'll get a fire going. There's beans in the pot from this morning. Heat them up if you're hungry." He set to work building the fire with practiced efficiency, and soon the cabin was filled with warmth and flickering light. Clara heated the beans and found cornbread wrapped in cloth. They ate in silence, exhaustion making conversation seem like too much effort. Afterwards, Silas spread several thick furs on her cot. "Gets cold at night," he said gruffly. "These'll keep you warm." Clara thanked him, but as she lay down on the narrow cot, she couldn't help but notice how small it was, how the ropes supporting the thin mattress creaked ominously under her weight. She tried to make herself as small as possible, lying rigid and still, terrified of hearing the crack of breaking wood. Sleep was a long time coming. In the darkness, she could hear Silas's steady breathing from his corner of the cabin. She wondered what madness had brought her here, to a stranger's home on a frozen mountain. She wondered if her family would even notice she hadn't arrived safely. She wondered if Thomas Whitmore slept soundly tonight, unburdened by the cruelty he'd inflicted. Most of all, she wondered how long it would take before Silas Kincaid realized what everyone else already knew, that Clara Vance was more trouble than she was worth. The days fell into a rhythm as steady as the falling snow. Silas rose before dawn each morning, his movements quiet in the darkness. He'd build up the fire, pull on his heavy coat and snowshoes, and disappear into the forest to check his trap lines. Sometimes he'd return by midday with rabbits or fox pelts. Other times he'd be gone for 2 or 3 days, following the animals deeper into the mountains. Clara's responsibilities became clear through observation rather than instruction. She kept the fire burning, melted snow for water, prepared meals from the supplies in the cabin. She mended Silas's clothes, discovering that his buckskin jacket had a tear in the shoulder that she carefully stitched closed. She swept the floor, organized the shelves, tried to make the rough cabin feel more like a home, but the cot remained a source of constant anxiety. Every night, Clara lay as still as possible, convinced that any movement would send it crashing to the floor. One morning, she woke to find the rope supports had stretched, leaving the mattress sagging nearly to the ground. She'd spent half the day trying to re-tension the ropes, but they were old and frayed, and her weight was simply too much for them. That night, rather than risk the cot breaking completely, Clara made a nest of furs near the fireplace and tried to sleep there instead. The floor was hard, but at least it wouldn't collapse beneath her. She woke hours later to find Silas standing over her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Cot break?" he asked quietly. Clara felt her face flame with shame. "I'm sorry. I tried to fix it, but the ropes should have said something." His voice wasn't angry, just matter of fact. "I'll take care of it." He disappeared outside despite the late hour, and Clara heard the sound of an axe biting into wood. Mystified and embarrassed, she remained by the fire, pulling the furs around herself. What was he doing? making kindling out of the broken cot. An hour passed, then two. Finally, the door opened and Silas entered, carrying an armload of fresh-cut lumber. He set it down and immediately went back outside for more. 3 more trips, and then he began working by the firelight, his hand sure and steady despite the hour. Clara watched in amazement as he built not a cot, but a proper bed frame, wide and solid, constructed from thick oak branches he'd harvested from the forest. The joints were fitted together with precise notches, secured with wooden pegs. He wove new rope supports in a tight pattern that wouldn't stretch or sag, then doubled them for extra strength. "You don't have to," Clara began, but Silas cut her off. "Yes, I do." He didn't look at her as he worked. "You're holding up your end of our bargain. Least I can do is make sure you got a proper place to sleep." When he finally finished, gray light was seeping through the cracks in the window shutters. The bed frame stood solid and strong, wider than the cot had been, with the thick furs arranged carefully on top. "Try it," Silas commanded. Clara approached hesitantly and sat down on the edge. The frame didn't creak, didn't shift. She lay back, her heart in her throat, waiting for the crack of breaking wood, but the bed held firm, steady as stone. "It's perfect," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "Thank you." Silas just nodded and turned away to begin his morning routine as if he hadn't just spent half the night crafting furniture by firelight. As if the simple act of making sure she had a comfortable place to sleep wasn't the kindest thing anyone had done for her in years. Clara lay in her new bed, listening to him move about the cabin, and felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not hope, exactly. She'd learned not to trust that particular emotion, but perhaps possibility. As winter deepened and the snow piled higher against the cabin walls, Clara began to notice small changes, little acts of kindness that Silas clearly thought she wouldn't see. One morning, she woke to find a bouquet of pine branches with vivid red berries arranged in a tin cup on the table. Mountain ash, she learned later, one of the few plants that added color to the winter landscape. Silas was already gone on his trap lines, and when he returned that evening, he never mentioned the branches. But Clara saw him glance at them, saw the barely there softness in his eyes before he turned away. Another time, she found that someone had lined her boots with rabbit fur, soft and warm against the harsh cold. Her old boots had been thin-soled and offered little protection against the mountain winter. These newly lined ones were like walking in warm embrace. "Did you do this?" she asked Silas, holding up one boot. He barely glanced over from where he was skinning a rabbit. Fur was left over, seemed wasteful to throw it out. But Clara had watched him work. She knew every scrap of fur was valuable, could be traded in town for supplies. Nothing was ever wasted in this harsh environment. He'd done it for her, just for her. Clara found herself reciprocating in her own silent ways. She noticed that Silas's coat, while thick and well-made, wasn't lined properly. The stitching had come loose in places, letting cold air seep through. While he was out checking traps one day, she carefully took the coat apart and relined it with wool she'd unraveled from an old blanket she'd found in her trunk. The process took hours, her fingers cramping from the tight stitches. But when Silas put the coat on the next morning, she saw him pause, felt his questioning look. "Needed mending?" Clara said simply, echoing his own dismissive explanations. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, perhaps. an acknowledgment of the care they were taking with each other, even if neither was ready to speak it aloud. Silas began teaching her about the mountain, how to read the weather in the color of the morning sky, how to tell the difference between the tracks of a fox and a coyote in the snow, which plants were edible, which ones medicinal, which ones deadly. He taught her to shoot his rifle, patiently correcting her stance until she could hit a target more often than not. "Why are you teaching me this?" Clara asked one afternoon after she'd successfully brought down a rabbit at 30 yards. Silas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant peaks. "Because the mountain doesn't care if you're strong or weak, pretty or plain. It only cares if you're prepared, and I won't always be here to protect you." The words sent a chill through Clara that had nothing to do with the temperature. She'd grown so accustomed to his steady presence, his quiet competence. The thought of facing the mountain alone terrified her, but there was something else in his words, something that made her heart beat faster. He was preparing her as if she'd be staying, as if this arrangement was more than temporary, as if he wanted her to survive because her survival mattered to him. At night, when the fire burned low and darkness filled the corners of the cabin, Clara would lie in her sturdy bed and listen to Silas breathe. Sometimes, when she couldn't sleep, she'd hear him moving restlessly, hear his muttered words in the grip of nightmares. "Sarah," he'd whisper, "children, I'm sorry, so sorry." On those nights, Clara would want desperately to go to him, to offer comfort, to tell him that whatever ghosts haunted him were not his fault. But she remained in her bed because she knew her touch wouldn't be welcome. How could it be when she was so much less than his lost Sarah surely had been? The winter solstice arrived, the longest, darkest night of the year. Silas surprised Clara by producing a bottle of whiskey and 2 precious oranges he'd bought on his last trip to town months ago. "Been saving these," he said gruffly, cutting the oranges into careful sections. "Figured tonight was as good as any." They sat by the fire, sharing the oranges, a luxury so rare that Clara savored each burst of sweetness on her tongue. The whiskey burned pleasantly, warming her from the inside out. "Why did you help me that day?" Clara asked, emboldened by the whiskey and the intimacy of the firelight. "At the station. You could have just walked away." Silas turned his cup in his hands, firelight glinting off its surface. "You looked like I felt," he said finally, "like you were ready to let the cold take you. I've been there. Know what it's like to think the world would be better without you in it." He met her eyes, and in his gaze Clara saw understanding, sympathy, shared pain. "Figured maybe we could both stick around a little longer, see if things got better." "Have they?" Clara whispered. "Gotten better?" Silas looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she'd arrived. His eyes traced her face, lingering on her features with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Yeah," he said softly. "Yeah, they have." The blizzard hit 3 days after the solstice, howling down from the high peaks with a ferocity that made the cabin walls shake. Silas had seen it coming, had read the signs in the sky and the behavior of the animals, and had spent 2 days preparing, bringing in extra firewood, checking the roof, securing everything that could blow away. "This is going to be a big one," he told Clara, his face grim. "Could last 3-4 days, maybe a week. We'll be fine as long as we stay inside." But on the second morning of the storm, Silas discovered one of his trap lines was unsprung. He'd set traps on the north ridge before the storm hit. Hadn't expected the weather to turn so quickly. Now there were animals potentially suffering in those traps, and Silas Kincaid was not a man who let animals suffer, even if it meant risking himself. "I have to check them," he told Clara, already pulling on his heavy coat, the one she'd relined with wool. "Silas, no." Clara caught his arm, fear making her bold. "The storm's too strong. You can't even see 10 feet in this snow. You'll get lost." "I know these mountains blind," Silas said, but even he looked uncertain as he peered out at the wall of white beyond the door. "I'll be back before nightfall." He left, rope tied around his waist and secured to the cabin, a lifeline in case he couldn't find his way back in the whiteout. Clara watched him disappear into the storm, swallowed by snow within seconds, and felt dread settle in her stomach like a stone. Nightfall came. Silas didn't return. Clara kept the fire burning, kept watching the door, kept telling herself he was fine. He'd been surviving on this mountain for 7 years. He knew what he was doing. He'd come back. But as dawn broke on the 3rd day with no sign of him, Clara knew she had to act. She remembered what Silas had taught her: how to read the mountain, how to follow a trail, how to survive. She remembered him saying, "I won't always be here to protect you." But who would protect him? Clara dressed in every piece of clothing she owned, layers upon layers, until she was even larger than usual, but hopefully insulated against the deadly cold. She took Silas's rifle, the knife from the table, matches wrapped in oilcloth. She followed his rope as far as it went, then kept going, following the faint depression in the snow that might have been his trail. The storm had eased, but still threw snow in blinding curtains. The wind cut through even her layers of clothing. Her legs ached from pushing through drifts that sometimes reached her thighs. But Clara didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because somewhere out here was the man who'd built her a bed by firelight, who'd lined her boots with soft fur, who'd seen her not as a burden, but as a person worth saving. And she would be damned if she'd let him freeze to death alone. She found him 3 hours later, partially buried in snow where a rocky outcropping had given way beneath him. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and his face was gray beneath his beard. But his eyes were open, and when he saw her, something that might have been wonder crossed his features. "Clara?" His voice was weak, slurred. "No, you should have stayed." "Shut up," Clara said, dropping to her knees beside him. "Save your strength." She assessed the situation with the clarity Silas had taught her. His leg was broken, badly. He'd lost blood from a gash on his head. He was suffering from exposure, possibly hypothermia. She couldn't carry him. He was too heavy, and the distance too far. But she could move him. This was the moment when Clara's size, the thing she'd been ashamed of her entire life, became her salvation. She was strong, had always been strong, even if that strength had been dismissed as simply being big. She'd worked on her father's farm, had lifted hay bales and milk pails and feed sacks. Her arms were thick with muscle beneath the layers of softness. Her legs were powerful. Clara got her arms under Silas's shoulders, braced her feet, and heaved. He was massive, easily twice her weight. But she got him upright, got him balanced against her. Then she began to walk, half carrying, half dragging him back toward the cabin. It was the longest journey of her life. Every step was agony. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned. Several times she fell, and each time she had to dig deep to find the strength to get back up, to keep moving. The storm had picked up again, and she could barely see, but she remembered the path, remembered the landmarks Silas had taught her to recognize. In his delirium, Silas kept muttering. Sometimes it was names. Sarah, his dead wife, Emma and Thomas, his lost children, but increasingly it was Clara's name. "Clara, my Clara," he whispered against her neck. "Don't leave, please, can't lose you too." Those words gave her strength when her body had nothing left to give. She stumbled forward, dragging them both through the snow, refusing to let the mountain claim either of them. The cabin appeared like a miracle through the swirling snow. Clara sobbed with relief as she kicked open the door and dragged Silas inside. She got him near the fire, stripped off his wet clothes, wrapped him in furs. She splinted his broken leg with branches and torn cloth. She cleaned and bandaged his head wound. She made him drink warm broth, even though he was barely conscious. And then, when she'd done everything she could, Clara collapsed beside him and waited to see if her efforts would be enough. Silas woke slowly, swimming up through layers of pain and fog. The first thing he became aware of was warmth. Blessed, beautiful warmth. The second was a hand gripping his, fingers laced through his own. The third was Clara's face, pale and worried, hovering above him. "You're awake?" she whispered, and he heard tears in her voice. "Oh, thank God you're awake." "How?" His throat was raw, his voice barely functional. "How did I get here?" "I brought you." Clara's chin lifted in defiance, as if she expected him to be angry. "You'd been gone too long. I couldn't just wait for you to die." Silas stared at her, comprehension slowly dawning. She'd come after him, into the storm, had somehow gotten him back to the cabin when by all rights they should both be dead. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the exhaustion carved into her features, the barely healed scrapes on her hands, the way she was trembling with fatigue. "You saved my life," he said, wonder in his voice. "You saved mine first," Clara replied simply. "At the train station, remember? This just makes us even." But they both knew it was more than that. So much more. Over the next few days, as Silas recovered and the storm finally blew itself out, something shifted between them. The walls they'd both carefully maintained crumbled brick by brick until there was nothing left but truth. It started with Silas, perhaps because his brush with death had stripped away his careful control. He told Clara about his wife Sarah, how they'd met young and married younger, how she'd been tiny and delicate like a bird, how he'd loved her, but had also felt he had to protect her constantly, as if she might break. "I was always so careful with her," Silas said, staring into the fire, "so afraid my strength would hurt her. When she died, I thought God was punishing me for being too rough, too much." "That's not how fevers work," Clara said gently. "I know, up here." Silas tapped his temple. "But here?" He pressed his fist to his chest. "I've been carrying that guilt for 7 years, using it as an excuse to stay away from people, to stay away from feeling." He turned to Clara then, his gray eyes intense. "And then you showed up. And you weren't delicate. You were strong, real. You didn't need me to protect you. You protected yourself, protected me." He reached out, his calloused hand cupping her cheek. "Do you know what it's like, being with someone who doesn't feel like they might break? Someone whose strength matches yours?" Clara's breath caught. "Silas, I've been watching you, Clara. The way you move, the way you work, the way you take up space without apologizing for it, and He swallowed hard. I've never wanted anyone the way I want you, not for what you can do, for who you are." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. I'm not, I'm not what men want. I'm too big, too much. Thomas Whitmore Thomas Whitmore is a fool," Silas interrupted fiercely. "He looked at you and saw only what society told him to see. I look at you and see someone who trekked through a blizzard to save a broken mountain man. Someone who turned a rough cabin into a home. Someone whose hands are as skilled at mending clothes as they are at shooting a rifle. I see warmth and strength and courage." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "I see the woman I've been falling in love with since the night I built you that bed." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and perfect. Clara couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All her life she'd been told she was too much, too large, too heavy, taking up too much space. But Silas looked at her as if she were treasure, as if her size was not a flaw, but a gift. "You built that bed for me," she whispered, understanding flooding through her. "Not because I needed it, because you wanted me to be comfortable, to have space. I built it because I wanted you to have everything you deserve," Silas corrected. "And you deserve to take up space, Clara. You deserve to sit without fear, to sleep without worry, to exist without apologizing." He pulled her closer, and Clara went willingly, settling against his side despite his broken leg. He kissed her forehead, her temple, her cheeks, each touch gentle but sure, as if he were memorizing her through his lips. "I love you," Clara breathed against his chest. "I thought love was for other people, smaller people, better people." "Love is for anyone brave enough to accept it," Silas murmured into her hair. "And you, Clara Vance, are the bravest person I know." They sat like that through the night, the fire burning low, the storm finally silent beyond the cabin walls. Two broken people who'd found each other in the wilderness and discovered that sometimes the best healing comes not from fixing what's broken, but from accepting it, scars and all. The spring thaw came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the mountain. Streams ran full and fast with snowmelt. Green shoots pushed through the last patches of snow. Birds returned, filling the air with song. And in the cabin on the high ridge, two people prepared for a beginning. Silas's leg healed slowly but well, thanks to Clara's careful nursing. By the time the trails were passable again, he could walk with only a slight limp. His first journey down to Pine Ridge was to purchase supplies and to have a private conversation with the circuit judge who visited the territory towns. When he returned, he found Clara in the garden plot she'd started on the south side of the cabin, coaxing seeds into the rocky soil. She looked up at his approach, shading her eyes against the bright sun, and smiled. That smile, open and genuine and unguarded, hit Silas like a physical blow. He'd never thought to see her smile like that, never thought to be the cause of it. "I have something for you," he said, dismounting and walking to where she knelt in the dirt. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and stood. "What is it?" Silas reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. "This. It's a marriage license. Judge wrote it up for us, if you'll have me. I know I'm not much, just a scarred mountain man with a rough cabin and a rougher past. But I swear to you, Clara, I'll spend every day of my life making sure you know you're loved. Not despite who you are, but because of it." Clara took the paper with trembling hands, staring at the official script as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. "You want to marry me?" more than I've wanted anything in 7 years." Silas dropped to one knee before her, an act that cost him giving his healing leg, but he didn't care. "I know you came here as a mail-order bride to someone else, but I'm hoping you'll stay as my chosen bride, my wanted bride, my beloved bride." The tears came then, hot and fast, but for the first time in Clara's memory, they were tears of joy. "Yes," she sobbed, falling to her knees to meet him. "Yes, yes, yes." They married 3 days later, under the ancient pine tree that stood sentinel at the edge of the ridge. No church, no guests, no crowd to judge or whisper. Just Clara in a new dress she'd sewn from blue fabric Silas had bought in town, a dress that fit her properly, that didn't try to hide or minimize her body. Just Silas in his best buckskins, his beard neatly trimmed, his eyes never leaving his bride's face. They spoke their vows to each other and to the mountain that had tested them and found them worthy. Silas carved their names into the pine's thick trunk. Silas and Clara Kincaid. Spring 1876. Forever. That night, as man and wife, they lay together in the bed Silas had built. A bed now wide enough for both of them, strong enough to hold them both. Outside, a late snow fell softly, but inside the cabin all was warmth and joy, and the kind of love that grows not from passion alone, but from shared survival and mutual respect and the simple miracle of being truly seen. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked, her head on Silas's shoulder. "Choosing me?" "Every single day," Silas replied, and when Clara stiffened, he pulled her closer. "I regret that I didn't choose you sooner, that I let 7 years go by before I found you, that I wasted time thinking I didn't deserve this." He kissed her hair. "But regret choosing you? Never. You're the best decision I ever made." Clara smiled in the darkness, her hand splayed over his heartbeat. "I was wrong, you know. Back at the train station when I thought my life was over, it wasn't ending, it was just beginning." "Our life," Silas corrected gently, "not yours or mine, ours." And in that single word, ours, Clara heard everything she'd ever needed. Acceptance, belonging, home. The cabin had grown. What had been a single room was now several. Additions built piece by piece as needs arose. There was a proper bedroom, a separate area for storage, even a small room that served as a workshop where Clara made the quilts and preserves she sold in town. On the porch, Clara sat in the chair Silas had made her, wide and sturdy, with armrests carved with mountain flowers. In her arms she held their son, William, named for Silas's father. The boy was 2 years old, all dark hair and gray eyes, with his mother's strong build and his father's quiet intensity. Down the slope she could see Silas returning from his trap lines, moving with the sure-footed grace she'd come to associate with him. He saw her watching and raised his hand in greeting, his pace quickening. When he reached the cabin, he didn't go inside to unload his furs first. Instead, he came straight to the porch, to his family. He leaned down to kiss Clara, a kiss that still made her heart race even after 5 years, and then scooped William out of her arms, tossing the boy in the air until he shrieked with laughter. "How was your morning?" Silas asked, settling onto the porch rail with William perched on his good leg. "Productive. I finished the quilt for the tailor's wedding gift, and William helped me plant the last of the beans." Clara smiled at her son, who was now trying to grab his father's beard. "We might have planted more dirt than seeds, but we tried." Silas laughed, a sound that never got old, never failed to warm Clara from the inside out. In the years since their marriage, the harsh lines of his face had softened. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced with contentment. He looked, Clara thought, like a man who'd finally found peace. "I ran into the station master in town yesterday," Silas said, his tone carefully casual. "He mentioned that Thomas Whitmore's third wife just left him. Apparently, he's quite bitter about the whole institution of marriage now." Clara met her husband's eyes, saw the question there. Did it still hurt? Did she still carry the wound of that rejection? "Good," she said simply, and meant it. Because if Thomas Whitmore had been a better man, if he'd kept his promise, she'd be trapped in a loveless marriage in some dusty frontier town. She'd never have climbed this mountain, never have met Silas, never have discovered that her size, which she'd been taught to see as a burden, could also be a source of strength. "I'm glad he rejected me," Clara said, and Silas raised an eyebrow. "No, truly, because it brought me here, to you, to this." She gestured at the cabin, the mountain, their son. "I thought I was nothing because I didn't fit into someone else's narrow idea of what a woman should be. But I was wrong. I'm everything, exactly as I am." Silas came to kneel before her chair, William still in his arms. "You're everything," he echoed. "You always were. I just feel blessed that I got to be the one to see it." Their son chose that moment to grab a fistful of his mother's hair, tugging with the thoughtless strength of a toddler. Clara laughed and gently disentangled his fingers, kissing them before releasing them. In that moment, surrounded by love, anchored by acceptance, finally home, she understood the truth she'd spent 28 years searching for. She wasn't too much. She was exactly enough. And in being enough for herself, she'd become everything to the people who truly mattered. As evening settled over the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, the Kincaid family sat together on their porch. They were an unlikely trio by society's standards, the scarred mountain man, the woman the world had called too big, and the child they'd created from their impossible love. But here, where the air was thin and the winters harsh, and survival depended on strength rather than appearance, they were perfect. They were home. They were proof that sometimes the greatest love stories don't begin with a prince in a ball gown, but with a scarred stranger and a rejected bride who dared to believe that broken things could heal, and in healing become stronger than they'd ever been before. In the cabin behind them, the fire burned warm. Above them, the first stars emerged, and in Clara's heart, where once there had been only pain and doubt, there was now certainty. She had been loved all along by the one person whose opinion had ever truly mattered, herself. The mountain man had simply helped her see it.